Jane Russell wasn't just discovered. She was launched into controversy. At just 19, she was plucked from obscurity by billionaire aviator and film producer Howard Hughes, who cast her in a role that would define her entire life for better or worse. The film was The Outlaw, a Western that would have been forgettable had it not been for Hughes' obsession with Jane's body, and more specifically, her bust. Hughes famously designed a custom underwire bra for Jane, hoping to accentuate her figure in a way that would send Hollywood and America into a frenzy. And it worked. When the first promotional stills for The Outlaw were released in 1941, the reaction was instant and explosive. Jane was shown reclining seductively in a haystack, her neckline plunging well beyond what the era's moral gatekeepers found acceptable. The film was pulled from distribution before it was even properly released. Censors at the Hays office, Hollywood's self-appointed moral authority, deemed it indecent. Hughes, seeing an opportunity, fought back, not because he cared about artistic freedom, but because he knew controversy sold tickets. He personally arranged to stir the pot by submitting the film multiple times, knowing it would be rejected, fueling headlines every step of the way. What started as a publicity stunt became a national scandal. People who had never even heard of Jane Russell were now talking about her. Her image was everywhere, on posters, in newspapers, on billboards. Hughes fanned the flames further by planting stories in gossip columns and magazines. The Outlaw became infamous for a film that almost no one had actually seen. When it finally premiered, 2 years after filming wrapped, it was under heavy edits and strict time limits for certain scenes. But none of that mattered. The buzz had already made Jane a household name. Her notoriety wasn't just built on sex appeal. It was built on the idea that she had defied the rules. And that idea stuck. She was labeled a bad girl by Hollywood standards, though ironically, Jane herself was deeply religious and later said she found the whole ordeal humiliating. Still, the damage and the myth was done. She was now the woman who broke the system. America's accidental bombshell. But with that fame came scrutiny. Jane didn't control the narrative of her own career. Howard Hughes did. She became a figurehead for his brand of provocative showmanship, and she paid the price for it in her personal and professional life. Critics didn't take her seriously as an actress. She wasn't offered the same range of roles other stars were. To many, she was just a girl from a haystack photo. Still, Jane played the role she'd been handed, glamorous, bold, unashamed. The Outlaw didn't just make her famous. It made her a symbol of rebellion, of censorship, of a new era in Hollywood where sex and scandal will become currency. But this was only the beginning of Jane's story. Fame opened doors, but it also built walls she'd spent decades trying to break through. By 1953, Jane Russell was already a household name. But when she starred alongside Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, everything changed, both for her and for the way the public saw her. The film was meant to showcase two bombshells. But behind the scenes, it was clear this wasn't going to be a duet. It was Marilyn's coming out party. And Jane Russell, once the most talked about woman in Hollywood, was suddenly the other blonde. The irony? Jane was the one carrying the movie. Marilyn was notoriously late, unpredictable on set, and riddled with insecurities that made every scene a struggle. Jane, by contrast, was steady, focused, and utterly professional. Director Howard Hawks reportedly leaned on her to keep production on track, often having Jane stand in for Marilyn during lighting setups because she was dependable and composed. Behind closed doors, Jane wasn't just pulling her own weight. She was holding up the entire production. And yet, when the cameras rolled, Marilyn was electric. It didn't matter how many times she flubbed a line or missed a cue. Audiences couldn't take their eyes off her. In scene after scene, Jane delivered strong performances, sharp comedic timing, and charisma. But Marilyn glowed. The public didn't care who had more talent. They cared who had more magic. And in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Monroe's shine cast a long shadow over Jane. Still, there was no feud. Not publicly. Jane later said that she had no problem with Marilyn, calling her sweet, shy and confused. But the tension was real, and it wasn't between the women. It was between how Hollywood treated them. Jane had worked for years to build her image. Marilyn was skyrocketing overnight. Studios wanted more Monroes, not more Russells. That didn't stop Jane from stealing some of the spotlight in her own way. Her performance of Ain't There Anyone Here for Love, where she saunters through a gym of disinterested male athletes, became one of the film's most memorable moments. But once again, it was Marilyn's diamonds are a girl's best friend that dominated headlines, posters, and magazine covers. The public rebranded Jane overnight. No longer the ultimate bombshell. She was now the second blonde. And that came with a bitter twist. The same studios that once molded Jane into a symbol of controversy were now overlooking her in favor of a younger, more marketable version of the same archetype. Jane wasn't outdated. She was outmaneuvered. Still, Jane handled the shift with grace. She didn't lash out or spiral like others in her position might have. She continued to take on roles, work steadily, and carved out space for herself in a town that had already moved on. But the film marked a turning point. For the first time, Jane wasn't the storm. She was caught in someone else's. And yet, even as Marilyn soared, Jane never disappeared. She just evolved, quietly, stubbornly, and on her own terms. But the cracks in the Hollywood machine had already begun to show. And Jane, more than most, understood the cost of being cast as an icon in someone else's script. What happened next showed just how much that cost had hurt, even long after the cameras stopped rolling. As Jane Russell's Hollywood star began to flicker, she turned away from the studio lights and towards something most in the industry didn't understand: God. Not the casual kind of religion that gets mentioned in interviews or acceptance speeches. Jane went all in, deeply spiritual and fiercely outspoken. She embraced her Christian faith in a way that reshaped her identity, for better and worse. She wasn't raised in a particularly devout household, but tragedy would push her toward faith. In the early 1940s, Jane suffered a devastating miscarriage. The trauma left her physically unable to have children of her own. For a woman constantly framed as a symbol of fertility and desire, it was a quiet and painful contradiction. Instead of spiraling, Jane found refuge in Christianity. It wasn't a show. It was a lifeline. In the years that followed, Jane didn't just attend church. She built an entire second life around her beliefs. She founded the World Adoption International Fund WAIF, an organization focused on placing children in homes around the world. Long before adoption was trendy in Hollywood, Jane was knee-deep in the fight to help kids in need. She even adopted 3 children herself, proving that her convictions were more than just words. But her newfound spiritual image didn't sit well in the industry. This was the era of wild parties, studio control, and carefully polished public personas. Jane broke the mold. Again, while other actresses played the game, Jane went on talk shows railing against loose morals, Hollywood corruption, and what she called the decay of traditional values. It didn't take long for executives to see her as a liability rather than an asset. Even fans were confused. This was the same woman who posed provocatively in The Outlaw, now preaching about modesty and morality. The same bombshell who shared the screen with Marilyn Monroe, now calling out sexualization in media. The contradiction wasn't lost on Jane, but she didn't care. "People think I'm nuts," she once said. "I don't care. I believe in Jesus. I believe in doing what's right, and that's the end of it." To some, she was a hypocrite. To others, a hero. But to everyone, she was suddenly unpredictable. Jane wasn't afraid to speak out, and her words didn't always land softly. She openly criticized premarital sex, abortion, and what she saw as the moral decline of the film industry. For a town built on illusion, her blunt honesty was more than disruptive. It was dangerous. Studios stopped calling. She still had fans. She still had her voice. But the opportunities faded. Her faith had made her powerful, but it had also made her polarizing. In trying to reclaim her identity, Jane had distanced herself from the machine that once made her a star. And yet, she wasn't done fighting. Faith gave her strength, but couldn't protect her from the storm coming next. A battle far more personal than fame or controversy, because soon, Jane would face demons that no camera could capture. Publicly, Jane Russell projected confidence, conviction, and unwavering strength. But behind the scenes, her life was far more complicated. While Hollywood painted her as either a scandalous starlet or a born-again conservative, the real Jane existed somewhere in between, a woman constantly at war with her own image, her past, and the pressures no one ever saw. By the 1960s, the phone had all but stopped ringing. Jane's outspoken beliefs had alienated her from producers, and the glamorous roles she once dominated were now going to a new generation of actresses. She pivoted to stage work in nightclubs, performing in Vegas and on the road, trying to keep some semblance of her career alive. But the money wasn't the same, and neither was the attention. For someone who had once been plastered on every billboard, the silence was deafening. The struggle wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Jane had always wanted a big family. After her miscarriage, she adopted 3 children, but her home life was far from peaceful. Her first marriage, to football star Bob Waterfield, looked perfect on paper. 2 American icons, raising a family together. But the relationship was volatile. Rumors of infidelity followed Bob throughout their marriage, and Jane admitted years later that their fights were frequent and intense. After 25 years, they divorced, a quiet end to what had long been an unhappy union. And then came the drinking. For someone so vocal about morality, Jane's dependence on alcohol was a sharp contradiction. She drank heavily, often starting in the morning and continuing through the day. Friends describe her as functioning but fading. She would speak at church events in the afternoon, then hit the bottle by evening. Jane herself acknowledged the problem, calling it her hidden sin. But addiction doesn't care how righteous you are or how famous you used to be. Her later marriages didn't bring much peace either. Her second husband, actor Roger Barrett, died just 3 months after their wedding. Her third, real estate broker John Peoples, gave her some stability, but by then Jane had become more of a recluse. She kept busy with charity work and religious speaking engagements, but the sparkle of her early career had long since dulled. She had gone from bombshell to cautionary tale, from tabloid queen to forgotten icon. Still, Jane never saw herself as a victim. She was brutally honest about her choices, her regrets, and her struggles. "I made mistakes," she said, "but I've always told the truth." That truth, though, was often uncomfortable, especially for an industry that thrives on fantasy. By the time she reached her 70s, Jane had found peace, but at a steep cost. The fame had faded, the spotlight had moved on, and the world had changed. But Jane never stopped being Jane, opinionated, unapologetic, and unwilling to pretend she was anyone else. What she didn't know was that a new generation was about to rediscover her, not for her roles, but for the fight she waged just by being herself. By the time the spotlight faded from Jane Russell's career, one thing had become painfully clear. Hollywood had used her, profited from her, and discarded her the moment she stopped fitting the fantasy. Jane wasn't just a starlet who lost her fame. She was one of the first public victims of an industry built on double standards. And what makes her story so brutal is that she knew it was happening in real time and called it out before anyone else dared to. In interviews later in life, Jane didn't hold back. She described Hollywood as a place that loved your image more than your soul. She was never shy about pointing out how she was praised when she kept quiet, when she posed, smiled, and played the role. But the moment she spoke out about her faith, about her politics, about her right to not be sexualized, she was shut down. It's a cycle still seen today, but Jane experienced it decades earlier, when speaking up could mean the end of your career. Early on, Jane was forced to play a very specific role: the bombshell, the vixen, the forbidden dream. But she wasn't allowed to be complex. When she tried to take on more serious, dramatic parts, studio heads pushed back. Nobody wants to see you do Shakespeare. One producer reportedly told her, "They want to see what Howard Hughes paid for." And there it was. Her entire brand had been built on her body, not her brain. Her acting talent was always overlooked in favor of her curves, which Hughes had literally engineered into Hollywood history. She was both a product and a prisoner of that image. The hypocrisy became even more obvious when she aged. While male stars from her era, like Cary Grant or Clark Gable, were allowed to mature into distinguished roles, Jane was written off the moment her waistline changed. For actresses in her era, aging wasn't natural. It was criminal. Jane tried to push back against that, taking roles in theater, advocating for adoption, using her platform to do real work. But the system never wanted her to evolve. And then there was the political side. Jane was a proud conservative at a time when that didn't play well in Hollywood circles. She spoke out against the sexual revolution, backed right-wing causes, and even criticized feminism, something that alienated her from many in the industry. The very town that had objectified her for years now labeled her difficult and old-fashioned because she rejected the very machine that built her. And the irony? She wasn't demanding more screen time. She was just demanding to be treated like a human being. It's no surprise that decades later, people began to look at Jane's story differently. In the #MeToo era, when Hollywood's dark underbelly was finally exposed, Jane's decades-old interviews resurfaced, and suddenly, she sounded less like a bitter former star and more like a woman who had been ahead of her time. Because Jane didn't just suffer under the system. She exposed it, and she did it long before it was safe. But in the final years of her life, Jane proved that despite everything, fame, fallout, faith, she still had one more thing left: legacy. By the time Jane Russell passed away in 2011 at the age of 89, most of Hollywood had long moved on. Her name didn't carry the weight it once had. To some, she was just a relic of the old studio system, a black and white beauty from a forgotten era. But beneath that surface was a story far more powerful. Because while Jane never reclaimed the fame she once had, something else happened, something deeper. She became a symbol, not just of glamour, but of grit. In her final decades, Jane Russell wasn't chasing stardom. She was living on her terms. While other celebrities clung to relevance through desperate reinventions or social media stunts, Jane stuck to what she believed. She continued to work with her adoption foundation, speak at churches across the country, and support veterans and children's causes. In a world obsessed with reinvention, she was proudly unchanging. And oddly enough, that's what made her relevant again. As the internet matured and younger audiences started rediscovering classic cinema, clips of the Outlaw and Gentleman Prefer Blondes began circulating again. YouTubers dissected her story. Film historians started revisiting her films, not just for the scandal, but for her performances, her comedic timing, her presence. And in this new light, viewers saw someone who had been underestimated for decades. Jane wasn't just a pretty face. She was a survivor. Even modern celebrities began referencing her, some for her fashion, others for her defiance. Her name appeared in retrospectives alongside women like Marilyn Monroe, Rita Hayworth, and Mae West. But unlike many of her peers, Jane's story had a twist. She hadn't been destroyed by Hollywood. She had walked away from it. Bruised, yes. Burned, absolutely. But not broken. In fact, Jane remained sharp and unfiltered until the very end. In one of her last interviews, when asked if she had any regrets, she replied, "Hell no. I gave it everything I had, and I didn't let them tell me who I was." That, right there, is a legacy Jane Russell left behind. She wasn't a cautionary tale. She was a challenge to the system. She broke the rules they wrote for women. She paid the price. But she also left behind a blueprint for how to speak out, for how to survive scandal, for how to stand your ground when the whole machine is trying to turn you into something else. And maybe that's why her story is resurfacing now, not just because she was beautiful or bold, but because she was real, flawed, complicated, and completely unwilling to be silenced. Jane Russell didn't fade quietly into history. She lingered, like smoke from a fire the industry thought it had put out. But Jane never needed their spotlight to shine. Jane Russell didn't just challenge Hollywood norms. She shattered them. From the moment she stepped on screen, the industry tried to mold her, contain her, and ultimately erase her once she stopped playing along. But Jane didn't go quietly. She turned scandal into survival and rejection into rebellion. Her life was a constant contradiction. Sex symbol and devout Christian, Hollywood icon and social outsider, fiercely opinionated and heartbreakingly human. But through all the chaos, she never lost herself. Even when the roles dried up, when the headlines faded, and when her choices sparked backlash, she stood firm. She was never just acting. She was always being Jane. And maybe that's why her story matters now more than ever. In a world still reckoning with celebrity, power, and control, Jane Russell's legacy is a reminder of what happens when you refuse to be packaged. She was ahead of her time, flawed, fearless, and brutally honest. Hollywood might have written her off, but history is writing her back in. If you found Jane Russell's story as wild, raw, and revealing as we did, hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're just getting started digging up the stories Hollywood hoped you'd forget. Thanks for watching.